Good morning and welcome to all those watching live and to those watching at a later date. My name's Alan Parkinson. I'm the Vice President of the Geographical Association. Thank you so much for supporting the GA's annual conference this year. We have Susan Pike's presidential lecture. But before we start, we need to make an apology to Discover the World Education. At last night's GA Awards, their award was missed from the presentation. Aya Fiatli Yokudl, 10 years on, a geographical perspective by Karen Caulfield, Discover the World Education, was awarded a highly commended by the judges. They felt this comprehensive resource was excellent and could instantly see how they could use it. It takes the eruption of E16 in 2010 and returns to it 10 years later to consider what we learned from this event in a geographical perspective. It's well structured, wide-ranging, accessible, and helps students and teachers alike. You can find it on the Discover the World Education website. Well done. And it's now my pleasure and privilege to be introducing Dr. Susan Pike, GA President for 2020-21, to give her presidential address, Compassionate Geographies. Susan is currently a lecturer in geography education at the School of STEM Education, Innovation and Global Studies at Dublin City University. Over the past 20 years, Susan has designed and taught on a range of modules in geography, human rights, citizenship, history, and science education. She has an interest in early childhood education, as well as contributing to master's options in climate change education and poverty and social inclusion in education. She studied at Nottingham University under the late Professor John Cole, has previously taught geography and was a head of department in England. She's secretary of the GA's Early Years and Primary Phase Committee, has chaired the GA's education group meetings for the last year, and is a GA trustee. She's a member of the Geography Education Research Collective, Jericho, and her own research interests span teacher education and education at all levels, and is currently working on the Science Foundation Ireland Irish Sign Language Glossary for Geography and Environmental Science. She's the author of the book Learning Primary Geography, which draws its ideas and inspiration from classrooms, and received the Geographical Association Award for Excellence in 2016. Susan's presidential theme of compassionate geographies has grown in significance and resonance since it was first announced. We've all become increasingly aware of our own personal geographies and connections with others, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Colleagues, Dr. Susan Pike.
Thank you, Alan, for that lovely introduction. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I chose Compassionate Geographies for the theme for our conference this year, as to me it embraces all the GA stands for. Compassion for the planet and all the life upon it, as well as compassion for each other, the geography education community. Over the years, as you'll see, it's a word I've been drawn to. And as Alan just said, this year, it's become even more important in our lives and communities. For this reason, using the words of Charles McCausey, I'd like to dedicate this lecture to all of you who've been affected by COVID-19. My thoughts especially with anybody who has lost anyone dear to them because of the pandemic. So compassion is the essence of geography, as it's all about life on Earth, including people and all other plant and animal life. Because we teach with care about the sustainability of Earth and all its life in a time of climate emergency. As teachers, we're honest, but hopeful about the future, especially for our youngest geographers. We also recognise the untreatment of the environment and people. Some are cared for and receive compassion, and others not. But through geography, we can teach about equality and justice in context, as our subject is all about real people and places. And as professionals, we develop our own thinking of all matters of compassion in geography. I think that's why we're here today. And I thank you on behalf of the GA staff, volunteers and community for taking the time to be here, to share, to learn for a more compassionate future. So with all this in mind, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on compassionate geographies under 3 interconnected areas. First, the compassion evident in the support and collaboration across our community. Secondly, compassion in understanding our learners, their lives, their experiences, their knowledges, and their heritages, as well as their hopes for the future. And finally, our compassion in bringing all this to what we do, teaching geography by supporting and challenging geographical learning. So to quote Maya Angelou, we will think about our compassion and passion with some style. So we are all passionate and compassionate, and we're definitely stylish because the Guardian said so. So I'm privileged to work with all these people full of style, new teachers at DCU who are both full of passion and compassion about the children they teach. I've been really struck over the past few weeks for their love for teaching as they finally got back into school and remembered why they chose teaching in the first place. So a special welcome to all of you who are student teachers or NQTs or any first-time attendees at the conference. It's really great to have you here. And do remember to say hello and introduce yourself at all the sessions and in the Wonder Room. Here's some more style. So it's an unbelievable privilege to be one of just over 100 GA presidents and one of just 13 female presidents. We know Alan and Alistair will follow me, but I'm wondering who will be next, who will be the next presidents, and who from today's lectures and seminars will want to become a little bit more involved in the GA. One of the presidents that I'm particularly drawn to is Alice Garnett. Her research on students and mapping is still drawn on today by people working in this field, including me on my own master's thesis a few years ago. This thread of influence to me is the backbone of the GA, but it's always moving on and changing and adapting. So I hope Alice would be impressed with our plans for the future of the GA. As over the past couple of years, we've put together the GA strategic plan. As you can see, it sets out our aims, missions and objectives for the next 5 years. The whole GA community was involved in this, and it was driven by volunteers on governing body and education group. Alan, our amazing CEO, and all the staff and volunteers of the GA are involved in making it happen. As you can see, we're in the process of creating a larger, more diverse GA community. The photographs of the female presidents show that we've moved on in terms of gender and recognition of the different phases of education. But we must recognise that the community is largely white. And we know that being more diverse in terms of the ethnic makeup of the GA will help make us better. We also want to be better connected. And despite all the challenges, COVID-19 has helped us do so. Ultimately, we want to become a better connected community of teachers who can advocate, connect and empower teachers, something I'll come back to throughout this lecture. The strategic plan is a very general document, but it makes strong statements about the GA and what the association is acting on. I'll refer to it again and hopefully you will think about how you can become more involved in the community. As I said, the GA has a long history and the Geography Teacher Journal goes back many years. In 1975, Teaching Geography was launched. One of the words in our strategic plan is empower, and I think that's what the GA does best. So there's lots of proof of this in this 1975 edition of Teaching Geography. It's a real treasure trove for supporting teachers. Within the pages of the first Teaching Geography is work from Eleanor Rawling. Eleanor's piece on fieldwork was research-based and practical. It demanded students to think of an issue from all perspectives. I think it would fit well in today's journal. I could pick out so many articles, but was drawn to this because of the connections. When Alice was president, Eleanor did her PGCE. And when Eleanor was president, I did my PGCE. So I hope a very diverse mix of GA members I've met this year will also maybe one day become president or get involved in the GA a little more. Eleanor's work on the School Councils project in the 1970s was used by my geography teacher and made me love the subject. The principles of her work on the Geography Schools and Industry project is something I still draw on today and see my own students use to teach. Eleanor and her colleagues in the and her colleagues' work in the 1990s as I became a teacher helped me and many others make sense of the national curriculum. Her policy and curriculum work continues to be invaluable, used today by my own master's students, and has helped many of us through the challenges of curriculum development and change. It's also helped me publish on the history of geography education here in Ireland. So Eleanor's just one of the many GA community, and today there's still this determination to do the best in geography education. Just look at this year's journals examining our identity, who we are, who we listen to, and how this shapes our teaching. In other words, how we can be more inclusive. Our community, who's included, who's not, and how we can change this, how we can become more plural. And our perspectives on teaching and learning familiar and less familiar topics across geography, and how we can be more knowledgeable. Like many of you, I was told to join GA. Back in 1993 at Southampton, my tutor, Nick Fosker, said, join the GA. So we all did. I learned very quickly about the community of geography educators. Nick was a real compassionate geographer who always promoted sustainability at Southampton and later on Kiel and Bath Spa. He really was a compassionate geographer. As just after telling us to join the GA, he invited us all round his house for food. And I know some of you listening had the same experience with Nick. No wonder I stayed. My first issue was another bumper issue of Teaching Geography. This continues. This is the latest edition of Primary Geography. And if you look down the bottom left-hand side, you'll see an article written by two of my own students, Hayley and Kira, on the global fashion industry. Their research into this topic was eye-opening for them and hopefully will inform other teachers. So all of these journals are just part of what the GA produces. They really are the best titles on the market in terms of geography education. And we use all of them that work in our context in Ireland at DCU. Just heading back to that 1993 edition of Teaching Geography, the GA at that time was doing what it also does today. And this is the work that's quite often hidden. So the 93 edition showed that the GA was doing the advocacy work for today, writing to Ron Deering in relation to the national curriculum, expressing its concerns for the future of the subject. So the GA continues to do this year more than any other in relation to striving for the best geographical experiences for our young people. The GA really does recognise the talents and abilities of teachers to make decisions and the resources to do that, but it also does more, lobbying in the broadest sense for geography. Just this week this is happening. The GA is working in relation to the recommendations of the Sewell report. The report denied institutional racism and directed teachers to follow a set programme that does not recognise empire, colonisation and exploitation in the teaching of geography. I know teachers want to do better than this, and it's through our work with governing agencies that the GA can advocate for a more plural and inclusive teaching in our subject. In our journals, we've set out how the GA stands on this. As Steve Puttick and Amber Murray quite rightly demand a more holistic and sustained anti-racism geography curriculum, including attention to Black, Indigenous and decolonial thought within the discipline, right through from early childhood to higher education. So the young people have the skills and critical thinking necessary to understand complex and shifting politics of space, place and knowledge at a global scale. I agree, but we do need to recognise there's inequality here, as some of our pupils do get this and others are not so lucky, and that with support from the GA and wider education community, there'll be an entitlement for all students. This is occurring on a daily basis through the Decolonising Geography WhatsApp group. Well done to Runa Ali and Dave Rees for starting this group back last summer, I think. The support for teachers through all the things you can see on the screen now has been amazing. There's 200 people in the group and the compassion is evident in seeking to rebalance the voices, views and representations of people and places in our teaching. There's a daily recognition of the journey we're all in to make geography more plural. And there will be more space for this over time. So do look for the sessions that have emerged from this group in the forthcoming days. One of the projects that has emerged through the Decolonising Geography group and has been funded by the GA is the Voices project. The GA has also funded work on examining issues relating to the A-level specs. And Jill Miller is, that's with Ian Pallett, and Jill Miller is creating communities of practice in relation to the Welsh curriculum. Going back to the Voices project, some of the comments already from the young people involved have been really interesting. So if you look at the bottom, that's like my journey. We had to leave our home tune, and that's really interesting. We don't usually get to talk about these things. So geography is opening up spaces for young people to talk about their lived experiences. Something else that has emerged from the group is writing. So writing in the journals and writing that come from the conference today. This work's been recognised last night with Fran and Fatima's work on questioning simple notions of national identity, realising that identity is complex and creating classrooms where difference is understood. Fran and Fatima invite us to ask questions and consider where on a continuum of creating space we are and where we'd like to be. I find these kinds of diagrams and templates and so on really useful in GA journals, and I'm sure lots of you listening do. They help us think about the kinds of conversations we have in classrooms and how we can present things. For my own work that Alan mentioned earlier, in learning primary geography, I know that I wouldn't have been able to create this book without the support of the GA. So through everything I've read, it's helped me think about lessons and what they can look like. So as teachers, we can help our children think about difference. We can create lessons that relate to issues and require our pupils to think hard about information, about views and opinions, and to critically examine the evidence they have. So the screen shows children in St Joseph's National School in Waterford doing this, considering how they can make their own lane safer, but doing that by listening to different people's opinions and critically examining all that evidence. You can see the evidence in front of them to take actions in their local community. In that case, it was a flyer that went home to parents. And in case you're wondering, they did make the lane safer. But this kind of thinking happens in all types of geography lessons. So here's Newtown National School, looking at the question, what have rocks got to do with us? Coming up with questions which I'll refer to in a bit, examining the evidence, and then exploring the use of rocks in their own locality. And linking this directly back to the past, the building of the workhouse in Kilmacthomas, and the links to the past and the famine. This kind of learning is shared so often in our community by schools, sharing fieldwork, and by teachers simply just sharing everything. But like in the past, and like at conference, this sharing always involves a conversation. The GA started from teachers sharing lantern slides. You can buy copies of them in the GA shop. And I think nothing's ever changed. We're still sharing images, resources, but it's the conversations that sit behind those that are really, really interesting. So just like in the past, even though we're doing it through social media, Drives, Zoom, and all these different tools, we're still sharing and we're still having those conversations. Incidentally, we must thank Brian Ellis, a GA member, who has donated to the GA to digitise the original lantern slides as part of the growing archive. The continuity to act within GA communities is as fascinating to me as the changes. So the work of the GA community happens over a number of places: the branches, the special interest groups, the phase committees, and the boards. All of these you can find out about on the website. And even though we're not meeting face to face anymore, I'm not going to put up pictures of Zoom shots. We are meeting in these same kind of ways, even though we're doing it online. So a special welcome to new members of the GA community: Hina Robinson as a trustee and Alex Forsyth as a finance manager, as well as all the new members this year. The GA stretches a long way, and here's Catherine, chair of the special interest group, talking about the Kampala branch of the GA and Benedict's visit to the UK. We also have branches all over the country, and here's just some of the things that have been going on over the last couple of years. The branches are really, really important because they engage our own students and pupils in the work of the GA. The reach is also far when it comes to the Teach Meet. So thanks to Dave Rogers for organising that this evening, and I hope to see lots of you there. Some of my best days in teacher education have been when I've brought my own students to the GA community, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's made such a fuss over them over the years. So the next area of compassionate geographies I'd like to talk about is children's geographies. The work of Roger Hart was really significant to me in terms of children's geographies, probably because I was a bit of a child geographer, and growing up in the 1970s, my early experiences being free to wander and walk to school, but on rainy days, there was a wealth of geographical television in the 1970s, even if it was only 30 minutes a day. The Wombles, the Clangers, Play School, and Mary Mungo and Midge, who lived in this scary apartment block, but had a wonderful view. I'm actually from a bit of a family of geographers. My dad was in the Navy. My mum is from Dover and was in a film all about Dover in the 1960s. Lots of different, and my Nana and Grandad always used to go to Spain, so I was always fascinated by different places. So even though my personal geography was small to begin with, I was always intrigued by other places. Some of my family had some interesting geography connections because my great uncle Samuel Shenton set up the Flat Earth Society in Dover in the 1950s. Unfortunately, he was a member of the Royal Geographical Society and spoke and wrote extensively on geographical themes. Unfortunately, these were full of what we would now refer to as misconceptions or more recently fake news. On the screen, you can see some of the letters he rather worryingly wrote to children. So, like many of you, for me, becoming a geographer was all about experiences at school, but also experiences at university. I was really fortunate to do my geography degree in Nottingham, and the only photos I appear to have came from one of my friends, Jim, and the rest of them seem to be us in the pub. Today, I often get my children to be geographers, although it's a bit more of a challenge now they're teenagers. But we've been really fortunate to travel, lots of home exchanges and so on, and we look forward to doing the same soon. So children's geographies to me is really important. It came from geography and it's rooted in the discipline. As I mentioned, Roger Hart's work is really significant for this. His doctoral thesis involved working with children in a town he called Invale for 18 months. His book, freely available online now, still provides insights to children's experiences of place and why we should be really mindful of our learners' identities and experiences in their own place. Drawing on Shirley Arnstein's work in the 1960s, it is Roger Hart who was behind the ladder of participation. And once you see this, you can't really unsee it all around children's degrees of participation and whether that's tokenistic or not, something for us all to think about in our own classrooms. The work of children's geographers really took off in and around the late 90s with the work of Sarah Holloway and Jill Valentine. And in 2003, the journal Children's Geographies was launched. I'm also really drawn to the work of Stuart Aiken, who recognises the contested spaces of children's identities and experiences. I really recommend reading some of his work. So what does this look like for us in geography? Here's junior infant children, so they're 5 and 6 in Furhouse Educate Together National School, looking at what seems quite simple features they can see in their local environment. But when young children do this, they begin to realise the impact people have on the environment, the entanglement between people, place, and the environment. They also begin to express their own opinions on places. When I listen to young children talk, I always think of Doreen Massey, because they recognise the many layers of place and can appreciate how places are not bound, but are contested because of their views and how those might vary from adults. This morning we had Simon Catling on the Generous Geographers panel, and his 2003 paper is amazing on children's geography and social justice. It's long at 44 pages, but I always get my own students to read it because it brings together so many ideas of children's geographies, capabilities, and learning. My own research backed up what I had read in all these different people's work, that children see places differently to adults. They have their own ideas about what should happen in places, but they also have really interesting ideas about the future. Sometimes their thoughts and ideas and their knowledge are used in their geography lessons or their other lessons at school, and sometimes they're not. But when they do, it really does make a difference to their experience of school. So it was really good to see Lauren drawing on her own doctoral thesis work and working with John McKendrick, who's done extensive work in relation to poverty and young people's lives in Scotland, working together in teaching geography. Recently, I got children in St Mary's National School and my own students to think about connections with place. And they explored all their various connections, including places in and around the local environment. It's also great to see the connections that get made around the world and how other researchers draw on work from this side of the Atlantic to inform their own work. Sarah Mills is one of our invited speakers at the GA conference this year, and it's going to be wonderful to hear her speak on Saturday. Sarah, along with Sarah Holloway and Louise, ask us to think really carefully about ideas of agency and to appreciate that whilst there's benefit in celebrating and studying children's agency, it is problematic for a number of reasons. There's an ongoing tension between theory and politics, and we do have to recognise that children are working against powerful forces that deny their agency. We also need to think about children's agency in schools and how they should be acting or learning in school. But then it's all back to teachers and thinking about what's appropriate and how we can make decisions about children's learning. More on that a little bit later. So there's lots to question about agency and also to think about the future. And Rob Nixon's work on slow violence and childhoods is something I've only really started to explore now, and how the impact of what children use now and what impact that will have on the future. And talking about the future, Kit Rackley really cleverly links climate change to safeguarding and asks us to think, when we're teaching about climate change, about the impact that it is happening or will have for our young children. Going back to my 1993 edition of Teaching Geography, I've always been drawn to the work of David Hicks, a frequent speaker at the GA conference. David and other people who work in futures education should really appreciate the impact they have on children getting to do lessons such as this. So this is St Mary's National School in Dublin, and the children are using the Eco Detectives resource, which I wrote for the Department of Environment here, inspired directly by David's work. And I think the photographs sum up the delight of thinking about the environment. This year, I've only managed to do this once, back in November, but the impact it had on both the children and the students who had had their placement cut short just the year before was profound. As one of the students put, they wrote really positively about their experience in the geography specialism, and then talked about how working with the children made them observe places differently. So despite having walked past that area of foliage almost every day, I never imagined how much joy it could bring to a group of first-class children. I could not see anything particularly special or enjoyable about this place, but this was not the case for the children, as they were visibly amazed that all this small patch of forestry had to offer. So these kinds of experiences, to me, are essential for children, and they're also essential for our student teachers, to get them to think differently about children, their lives and their experiences. So thanks to Daniel for letting me borrow his quote.
Susan, we've had lots of comments as you've been speaking. Lots of people discussing their own ideas about children's geographies, and also really appreciating the links that you're posting to your own reading and research, the ladder of occupation, and also children's agency. I'm reminded that it's the 100th anniversary of the first GA conference in 1921. And I wonder how many of those early GA presidents would have mentioned children's agency as being anything that they would have even considered. So the rise of young people's geographies is really fascinating and important. And if there are any questions at the end, we'll answer them. So please put some questions in the chat as we go.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. So I'm just going on to my last section, and it's really funny what Alan has just said, because my last quote for my last section is John Dewey. John Dewey wrote 100 years plus ago. So maybe the geography educators weren't discussing children's agency, but John Dewey certainly was, and he was also praising geography. So the unity of all sciences is found in geography. The world without its relationship to human activity is less than a world. There are so many John Dewey quotes I could put up, but his writing is still so relevant today. So the most famous one that he's quoted for so often is education, therefore, is a process of living and not a preparation for future living. So maybe some of those early geographers were reading John Dewey. I've written about John Dewey in primary geography, and I think it's my retirement plan to find out lots more about him. So going back to, it wasn't quite 100 years ago when I became a teacher, but it was quite a while ago. So much so that two of the schools that I taught in England before I moved over to Ireland have now been knocked down. But in each of these schools, I learned something different. So Bournemouth School for Boys was my first placement school. And there I learned to teach. I learned so much about the boys. I learned about the differences in their personalities. And I learned about the importance of teachers valuing other teachers. I remember the head of geography telling me that he was going to learn from me. This was completely amazing to me, because I didn't think that I had anything to teach him. But even just to hear that was something that made me feel a little bit more confident before I stood up and taught my first lesson. So in Oaklands was an amazing school, and I still feel so sad that it has been knocked down. There I really learned about equality and power in teaching. We taught integrated humanities, and the children learned about so many of the issues we're looking at in geography today, about inequality, about race, about environmental issues. I ended up teaching back there later on. King Richard was my first school, and there I really began to think about the teacher I wanted to be. And the school still exists. It's changed its name and it's changed its building, but I'm still in touch with lots of people I worked there. When I came back to Oaklands, I learned much more about inquiry and finally got my head around teaching inquiry. And at Hayling, I finally got the chance to put lots of that into practice and to lead geography. So I don't have many pictures. It was different times, but I love the one in the top left. That's me with 8BT on my last day of placement. I learned so much from the people in the photographs, the students and the teachers, and it's still true today from the students that you saw earlier. I mentioned inquiry because to me, it's been the most positive experience I've had in teaching. Of course, within geography, Margaret Roberts is the person we all think of when it comes to inquiry. And congratulations, Margaret, for your MBE, sorry. I love the way that Margaret really gets us to think about what we do, and again provides frameworks to help. So these kinds of frameworks we always use with our students, and it helps them begin to appreciate how to teach through inquiry. When you do stop and have that inquiry stance in the classroom, it is amazing what children do. The children you saw earlier doing the rocks, the lessons on rocks, came up with questions on scraps of paper. This is one of my favourite techniques. And without me even saying, they began to group the questions together. I knew I was going to get them to do this, but they began to do it anyway. And then they got their yellow stickies that Mary, the teacher, gets them to use and put their main questions. As we walked back down for our cup of tea, Mary said it was amazing what you got out of them. And I said, well, it's amazing what you make your class capable of. But a flip chart, a board, a page in their book, all of these opportunities to stop and get children to ask before we launch into our teaching. A little bit more about that in a minute. So again, another amazing framework is Margaret's aspects of inquiry framework, and that we can move backwards and forwards through these categories of inquiry. I find really helpful. So again, to return to one of my students in that wonderful opportunity back in November. So Mark said, inquiry-based learning is key as children are always wondering about the world. And that day, the students really did appreciate how the children wondered about the world. And as he goes on to say, one of the most important things I've witnessed was one child noticing environmental sounds. He told me he could hear a car engine and a bird chirping. I found this interesting as the child was listening as well as visualizing. And Mark then says something really important. I learned from engaging with the children. I was really fortunate in the last few weeks to have Mark as one of my students I was supporting on placement, and to have conversations with him. I was very unfortunate because I didn't get to see him teach like all the other students in my group, but to hear him then go and put this into practice in his school was wonderful, and how he was really determined that the children would develop and enrich their sense of place. So well done to Mark, and well done to all of my students who put these kinds of things in place. I think one of the most important things about inquiry learning is that it can help children think conceptually. So we can encourage children to ask the big inquiry questions, and then this kind of thing can emerge. So going back to Eleanor Rawlings, this kind of idea from the industries projects in the 70s, and also to Jeff Stanfield, my inspector, who started me doing this. I think Jeff can't believe that I'm still doing this, but it's amazing, the brainstorm of a product. The one on the left is Turkish Delight. There's a story behind why it's Turkish Delight, but I won't go into that now. And how a 10-year-old can think of all the connections and leading from them all the impacts of the things we eat and the things we do is quite amazing. The one on the right is from a 6-year-old, and it's ice cream. These show really clearly to me how children are able to think conceptually in primary school and of course secondary school and post 16, and how as teachers through that inquiry approach we can be really sure about where we want them to go and what we want them to think from this. So on the left, the idea was to think about different jobs and types of work that people do. On the right was quite a different set of lessons where we were thinking about food and food in different places in the world as part of lessons on geography and global citizenship. These kinds of lessons also always link to sustainability and the impact of our actions. It's not just when we're teaching these kinds of lessons that geography can be conceptual. Over the years, I've really learned how to help my students teach about different places by getting them to think conceptually about places. And I think this really helps, especially primary teachers, think about how we can move away from facts, from those PowerPoint presentations about place. So the boys in the photos are from St Joseph's Boys National School in Dungarvan in Waterford. And they over a number of lessons, they thought in different ways about Australia. So comparing places, thinking about diversity within Australia, as well as patterns across the country. So the GA really supports us do this, the Critical Thinking for Achievement project and the handbook that's available on the GA website, as do the articles. And again, another framework, so getting our young people to be more open thinkers, better at thinking, and making more sense of information. A great example of that just this week, just last week, and thank you to Brendan for the picture on Twitter, he couldn't help himself, is the tanker in the Suez Canal. So if we think about this, we have a little bit of knowledge about how things move around the world, but it also helps us to think about why that's happening, why there's such globalization of trade, and the impact of a change in that, like that happens. So I really recommend looking at the Geography and Global Learning research project. It's no wonder, and this is really significant for primary geography, that getting our children to be geoliterate has a huge impact on other areas of their learning. And I moved this slide around so many times in this presentation and thought about taking it out, but I think it's really, really significant. So geography, being a geographer, has a positive impact on other areas of children's learning. So just a few last ones to finish, and I just wanted to share another example of something that I think brings everything I've talked about today. So the boys in Scolersa in Coolock in Dublin, I had done a number of lessons with them, and we decided to look at a local issue, and to them the only local issue was the tunnel through to the shopping centre. Now myself and Joanne, their teacher, really wanted to do a little bit more than should the tunnel change. And as you can see, the slide shows the messiness of inquiry, the negotiation, the getting children to think about more than their own opinions, and thinking about how they can collect data. The negotiation and the broadening out of their questions over a number of minutes in a lesson. What arose from this, the lessons, the fieldwork and so on, was the children presenting to local decision makers at what was actually Grandparents' Day. So a bit like the trip to the workhouse earlier, the project kind of took off, and then some things worked out really well. And as you can see, the impact of the children being listened to was really significant. So it's really evident that we can think about geography as a subject of knowledge and understanding, but that there's such importance in drawing on our learners' ideas, and that all forms of knowledge are valid. And Catherine Walker and colleague, Catherine's here as a first-time attendee at the GA conference, have looked into this a lot, and their current work is looking at Somali immigrants in Manchester and looking at families' environmental practices. So whilst it's really important that we think about our children, it's also important to think about their families and their carers, and think about the knowledge that's within our communities. And some of the most interesting geography lessons do involve this engagement with the communities. And I know there's plenty of these kinds of learning activities being shared over the next couple of days. So we also need to recognise how much our children's own knowledge changes over time, and how in relation to, for example, GIS, our children have different knowledge to us. On a daily basis, they're using tools like Snapchat to work out where each other are. They're using their game-based games like Minecraft and Pokemon Go. So there's many, many layers of their places and experiences. But finally, it's important that we think about our teachers and their knowledge, and how the Ofsted framework gives us a great framework to think about our intentions, what our intentions are, but also how we're going to implement them, and what I've talked about today, that impact it has on young children. So over time, so much of what the GA does, the passion and the compassion for all of us as new and old teachers and teacher educators, has meant that I've had the confidence to try out so many things like you've seen in the photographs. And that's included in relation to inquiry, rethinking about how I teach inquiry in teacher education. So whilst my students may go out and experience inquiry, do that where would the butterfly like to live themselves, I've also, in the last few years, really began to think much more. I've always done this in an ad hoc basis, but thought much more about how I can get the students involved in inquiry in teacher education. So once I finish the conference in the next few days, this is what I'm going to be writing up a little bit more. We have one publication from it, but there's more to come. So the idea that we can stop and we can ask our student teachers what it is they would like from the modules we do, and how we can build the specialism around them. But as one of my students put at the bottom, and I think this pretty much sums up geographical learning and particularly inquiry, I think even with geography, they knew what they'd wanted to do with us, but they just gave us different options of how to do it. So that brings us back round to the agency of the teachers, especially when they're empowered by their geography community. So thank you to the GA. Thanks to everyone for being so compassionate, especially this year. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of emails and messages I've received from everybody. The excitement over this conference has, at moments, like just before I started this lecture, been quite overwhelming. It's been wonderful to work with you all, and thank you for all I've learnt over this year and all the other years. So thanks to everybody for listening to this today.
Susan, thank you very much. I'm sure if you were in person, you'd be getting a huge round of applause for taking us through your own experiences with the GA, and also the involvement that you've had with teacher educators, which I think is a privilege for my own experience working with teacher educators. It's that continuity, and you referred to the continuity also of GA presidents and the passing on of ideas and the passing on of thoughts. I'm sure there's going to be some further comments coming through as we talk, but I have a few questions that have come through in the chat. And the first is from Nick Blackthorne, who asks you, what would you say to great Uncle Samuel about his flat earth philosophy?
It was really funny. This is really funny because I only found it out about 5 years ago. But I said to my mum, Mum, did you ever think of mentioning this to me when I was doing A-level geography or when I was doing my geography degree? And she's just very matter of fact that he was doing his flat earth thing. So I don't know what I'd say to him, Nick. Probably show him the images from the Apollo's spaceship. But it is amazing that his work carried on despite the moon landings and so on. So yeah, I think I'd have a few geographical images to show him. Thanks, Nick.
The second one is, I guess it's for me as much as anybody else. Doreen Struthers mentioned a Dewey quote, "We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience." So what have you taken from the experience of having to put together this presidential lecture and have to think back over so much of your own practice and inspiration?
I think it's really, really, really difficult to put together. The lecture, and Nick, who just asked the question, had to do it a couple of years ago, because there's so much that you really want to say, and there's so much you could say. And Alan Parkinson kindly wrote up on Twitter that I was still writing my lecture the other day. I wasn't. I was cutting it down because I realised as soon as I started practicing it, it was too long. So there's so much that you want to say, and you have to be really, really selective. But the other thing that it really makes you realise is that there's always something else to read and something else to know in geography education. And I've done the same job now for 21 years, and I still learn every day from those students you saw, from the children that we get to work with, and so on. So the biggest problem was being selective. And in relation to Dewey, I think this quote is really interesting, the one that's up on the screen, because the reflecting on experience can happen when you're still having that experience. So I think my quotes from my students really show that they were really, even though they wrote that a number of weeks later when they did their assignment, and I did ask them if I could use them, that, you know, they were reflecting even in the moment the experience was happening for them, and I'm sure the children were doing the same. So yeah, it doesn't, the experience and the reflection doesn't have to be, I don't think it has to be, they don't have to be too separate.
We've also had a question from Alex Standish, which has prompted some other discussion in the comments as well. He was asking about the, what's the question there? What do you see as a relationship between concepts, facts, and inquiry in the curriculum? You mentioned inquiry, of course. But what do you see as a relationship between those three things?
Okay, well, the first thing to say, Alex, is I'm working off a different, I'm working off a different curriculum to the curriculum in England, but in relation to curriculum in the broadest sense, the way I see it is another diagram, and maybe again I should have put this in. I see it as an umbrella, and I see the question, or the inquiry question, as the umbrella itself, and inquiry as where you bring that umbrella. But the fact that the facts fall from to me, the facts fall from the concepts. So the facts and the skills fall from the concepts. And that's how I see it, and that's how I explain it. So the concept comes first. The concept is what you know as a teacher you want the children to get. And lots of facts will arise from that. So in terms of the rocks, I think that's a really good example, that the children had the questions to begin with because they had the rocks in their hands. And in the end, they asked the questions. But if they hadn't asked the questions I wanted them to ask, I would have said those questions. I would have suggested those questions strongly. They would have been included. But also the children ended up knowing a lot of facts about, you know, how rocks are formed, how rocks are used, which is what the curriculum here demands, quite rightly so. So that's how I see it. I like the idea of the umbrella.
Thank you, Susan. I think we only have 1 minute left, so I think just a few comments. In particular, one from Jeremy Krause, who describes it as a beautifully crafted address for this moment in time and our futures, thoughtful and generous of spirit. And I think that compassion is something that is going to be needed in all schools over the coming months for teachers and students as well. So any thoughts on that continuation of the compassion, you know, sustaining that compassion in the way that we have been doing once we get back in person?
For your conference, Alan.
Susan,
okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming along. Thanks, Alan. Thanks for chairing.
Thank you.